In this video, we're going to talk about macroevolution. And remember, there's actually two different definitions of macroevolution that we discussed in this unit. One is the idea that macroevolution just means making a new species, even if it's the same type of organism, like one bird evolving into two different types of bird species. But for this unit, or for this conversation, we're going to be using the idea that macroevolution means creating a new kind. Because evolution says that fish evolved into amphibians, and then later those amphibians evolved into reptiles. The reptiles evolved into birds and also into mammals. And so that's what we're going to look at is, what's the evidence that scientists propose for that kind of macroevolution? One kind of organism evolving into another. Now, one thing that we need to make sure we understand is, even if this evolution actually happens in real life, you cannot directly observe it. You can't observe it in the lab, you can't observe it in nature, and why is that? Well, I'm hoping you realize it's because it takes way too long. That even if it happens, scientists believe that this kind of evolution takes thousands and probably more likely millions of years to occur. This picture you have on your study guide shows a general idea of what the evolutionary theory, the macro side of it, kind of looks like. Either you had some kind of origin of life, bacterial life, which then evolved into all of these different aquatic creatures, simple organisms like jellyfish and worms, and then eventually also went off to the plants, and then you had fish and sharks, and then you had amphibians, and then later on reptiles and birds, and then mammals, and eventually people. So this is that big idea of macroevolution that essentially says that all living things alive today, plus everything that was extinct, that is extinct, that those all have a common ancestor. And so let's look at what scientists use as evidence. And we'll look at these different pieces of evidences, and we will talk about how scientists use them, and also how other people might interpret that evidence in a different way. The different evidence is classified into these three groups. And we'll look at, in this video, the first two, morphological evidence, which is essentially looking at the morphology, the shape of different organisms and seeing how they relate, as well as the molecular evidence, which is looking at the DNA. And then in future videos, we'll look at the fossil evidence. So the fossil evidence, scientists are going to argue, shows a change in biological diversity. Episodic speciation means that species appear, and then periods of mass extinction. So for example, they're going to look at the fossil evidence, and they're going to say, look, dinosaurs appear, and then dinosaurs go extinct. And they're also going to argue that it shows a trend of increasing complexity from single-celled organisms to more complex organisms. And so we'll save this for another video. Let's wrestle with these first two in this video. So here we go. In morphological evidence, we'll look at homologous structures and vestigial structures. So what homologous means, homo means the same. It means that these are structures that are the same, and it's because they're believed to be from a common ancestor. And this is a classic picture that you'll see in any kind of textbook, and it's showing us the bone structure of a tetrapod, or any kind of four-limbed animal. Now what's cool about the way that those limbs are all designed and built is that they have a very similar bone structure. Like, think about your arm. You've got one bone connected to two bones, connected to a cluster of bones from which come the digits, your fingers. Think about your leg. Same thing, you've got a femur, and you've got your tibia and fibia, and then you've got the cluster of the foot bones, and then the toes. All right? So our limbs are all built that way. But so's a cat. Any kind of cat you can think of. One bone, two bone, cluster bones, and then the digits, the claws and whatnot, right? Whether it's a whale or a dolphin, their limbs are similar too. One bone, two bone, cluster bones, digits. Even a batwing, one bone, two bone, cluster bones, and digits. Now, that's the evidence. Like, we see that. That's a fact. So how do you interpret it? Well, I'll try to give you the different interpretations. So one, anybody that believes in evolution is going to argue that this is evidence that all these living things in the distant past shared a common ancestor, and that common ancestor had four limbs, and those four limbs had a structure of one bone connected to two bones, connected to a cluster of bones from which came the digits. And so what we see today are all modifications on that ancestral design. Now, a person that doesn't want to believe in evolution, young earth creationists, old earth creationists, but there's lots of different examples, right? What they might interpret this evidence is, no, this is not evidence for common ancestry, this is evidence for common design. That the structure of having one bone, which you can use a nice ball and socket joint with, connected to then a nice hinge joint with the two bones, and the cluster of bones from which the digits come, This is just a really good design that has lots of different utility. And so our common creator, our common designer, just use that design over and over again because it has this great utility, the way the muscles attach to the bones, the different kinds of joints you can make. And so they're going to argue it's more of a common designer evidence versus common ancestor evidence. Same evidence, different interpretations. Vestigial structures are very fascinating, and I will show you a few examples, and then we'll talk about the different interpretations. Because vestigial structures are things that we see in real life. So what a vestigial structure, evolution proposes that something that's not being used by the organism, or especially if it gets in the way of the organism, has some like negative effect on the organism, will actually be diminished over time and actually lost. So, some examples. Snakes do not have legs. However, if you dissect a snake, you will often find residual little bones right about where the legs would be that kind of look like tiny little legs, and sometimes they'll even poke through just a little bit through the skin, and almost like little claws that are used sometimes during mating. And so we'll look at some examples. Actually, believe it or not, there's some lizards right now that are losing their legs. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. Another example, this is a bird called a kiwi. And what's cool about this kiwi is it lives on an island where there's no natural predators for it. And if you notice, there's something interesting about this bird. It has no wings. And the reason it has no wings, what it does is it comes out at night and it works its way through the dense undergrowth and it eats insects. And the wings actually just get in its way as it's working its way through the dense undergrowth. And so the idea is that over time, it would lose its wings. Here's a cave salamander that is interesting because it has no what? It has no eyes. It also actually has no pigment in its skin. And the reason for that, there's no reason to spend the energy putting protein in your skin, the pigment in your skin, because there's no sun. And because there's no sun, there's no light, there's no point in having eyes. Eyes are actually a liability. They can get poked, scratched, infected. And so not having eyes could actually be selected for. That's a common thing that we'll see with a lot of organisms in dark places like this octopus. It's at the bottom of the ocean. It also has no eyes, and it's also transparent. There's no reason to have that pigment, when there's no sun around anyway to get like a sunburn or anything. Now, what's interesting today is we see that there's some Australian skinks that appear to be losing their legs. Now, they're not lizards. They're a little bit different. They're similar, though. And they are living in very dense undergrowth, like leaf litter and things like that, and they're squirming through the leaf litter, and so their legs actually end up getting in their way as they kind of slither, if you will, through the leaf litter. So every generation, the skinks with the shortest legs have the easiest time getting food and finding a mate, and so the genes for shorter and shorter legs are being expressed more. And so you can see, even at this stage, those legs are so small, they're really not having much function. And there's other skinks where the legs are even smaller, and some have completely lost their legs and look very snake-like. And so the idea with vestigial structures is we can now see evidence of past evolution because, these traits which existed are now gone. Whether it's the legs and the wings, or whether it's, the eyes or, things that are lost. So how you interpret this evidence? Well, it really depends. There's a couple different ways to interpret it. One is that it's just simply not true that, the kiwi was created without wings, that the snakes were created without legs, and so forth. Another one, obviously in evolution, someone who believes in evolution is to say, yeah, strong evidence for evolution that shows, pretty big differences that can occur. Another interesting way to interpret, though, is this, that if you're not going to accept evolution, you could still actually embrace vestigial structures because you could say, look, I understand how you could lose a structure. For example, we know what the Hox genes are for building limbs. You could imagine how if those genes get mutated, those genes don't work anymore, and so you lose your limbs. That doesn't explain how limbs evolved in the first place. So you could actually argue that this is just more evidence for the fact that mutations tend to break things. Now, in this case, the genes that are being broken actually end up having a positive outcome, which is, leglessness or eyelessness. But it still doesn't, give any credence to the idea that mutations can create legs and can create eyes in the first place. So kind of interesting little ways to interpret that information. Now on to the molecular evidence that scientists will use, or evolutionists will use to support their theory. And the two we'll look at, so the biggest ones, in my opinion, are pseudogenes and then comparative genomics. What pseudogenes are, these are genes that you can still see in the DNA, and they're clearly the genes, that we know, like, oh, these genes build teeth, for example. But those genes have been turned off. They've been mutated. They're not functional anymore. But the idea is that these broken genes are remnants from the past. So, for example, if you think about those last examples with, like, the skinks are losing their legs, you would imagine that these now legless skinks will still have the genes for having legs because they used to, but those genes are turned off. And so now those genes have become pseudogenes. And so when you see them, you go, ooh, this is evolution that these skinks used to have legs. That's the idea. So what are some examples I can give you? Well, the two big ones that are often cited is the fact that whales that have baleen instead of teeth actually still have genes for having teeth. Those genes are just silenced. They're pseudogenes. And birds, though the vast majority of species of birds do not have teeth, they have beaks instead, right? They do have the same genes for building the enamel and actually building teeth. And so those would be examples that scientists point to of pseudogenes. The idea that this is evidence that birds and whales, which don't have teeth today, in the past, they evolved from organisms that did have teeth. That's their argument. Now, again, how does someone that doesn't believe in evolution interpret this information? Well, they may disagree and say these actually aren't the genes for teeth that are silenced. You're misreading the information. Or they might also say this is just like the last example, more evidence that mutations can break things. It doesn't explain where did the genes for teeth come from in the first place. The second area of molecular evidence that's probably the most often cited is the idea of comparative genomics. And so that's essentially, now that we have the technology to sequence the DNA of all these different organisms, you start comparing the genomes and you see how similar the organisms are. And this is, you probably have heard the data that, humans are 99% related to chimps as far as our genetics. So it's that idea. And one of the big ones that you hear about is cytochrome C. So cytochrome C is a very important protein. It's involved in the electron transport chain of the mitochondria, which hopefully we know, what that means. We've talked about that before. And so every organism that has mitochondria will have this protein because it's going to have it in the electron transport chain of its inner membrane. So what scientists do is they compare how does the cytochrome C compare in these different organisms. And when you look at it, so you've got number of amino acids that are different in that protein from a human to a chimpanzee. Well, it turns out our cytochrome Cs are exactly the same as a chimp's. Compared to a different kind of monkey, we have one amino acid difference. To another mammal, 9 or 10. A bird, frog, and so forth, and you can see that the differences get larger. And so their argument, and evolutionists would interpret this information and say, this is evidence that humans diverged from chimpanzees very recently, and we diverged, as mammals a long time ago, and from, birds and other reptiles and amphibians even longer. And so these organisms have been not interbreeding for longer periods of time, and so genetically they're more different. That's the idea. Now, someone that doesn't believe in evolution is going to look at this data and go, well, obviously humans, as far as morphologically and anatomically, are the most similar to chimps and other apes. Like, just when we look at our anatomy, we're the most similar to them compared to like a frog. And so obviously, our proteins are going to be more similar as well. So that's how they would analyze this data. So that's it for the morphological and genetic evidence. We'll look at fossil evidence for macroevolution in the next video, and I hope this was helpful. I'll see you next time.